Our journey begins in the middle of winter, not much more than a warm spell. In northwestern North Carolina, where I grew up, winter seemed to last forever. Especially if you're like me and you like your world green, it was a long time. But when I heard this noise, this song, in late winter, I knew that spring was right around the corner. This is the voice of the wood frog, just a rather plain-looking frog, dark brown males and slightly larger russet or tannish-colored females. It's also the northernmost frog. You can find wood frogs all the way up in northern Canada, even Alaska, far north of where other amphibians are capable of tolerating the climate. It's so well adapted to cold temperatures that the adults of this species can actually freeze. They can drop below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and when it warms up, they'll come right back to life, right back to activity. It's an amazing physiological adaptation. If you get a few warm days with some rain that fills up little fishless pools, sometimes even just puddles along roadbeds, wood frogs will find them. And before long, they're filled with egg masses. They come here, they breed in these puddles, and their larvae develop fairly rapidly, so that by the summertime, we have small frogs. And looking in here, we can see these egg masses. This is what they're coming here to do. Lay these beautiful, crystal clear egg masses, little black dots. Each one is a little embryo that's going to develop into the tadpoles. A couple weeks' time, tadpoles will come running out, and this little pond will be just absolutely filled with thousands of little wood frog tadpoles. And usually, here, it breeds in February. But this year, I'm sitting here in the first week of January, and the wood frogs are almost done breeding. Here in northwestern South Carolina, we're at the very southern limit of the range of the wood frog. And here, every year, we're seeing wood frogs breed a little earlier and a little earlier in the year. When wood frogs come out here and lay eggs late November and December like they did this year, and then we have a cold snap and the temperature falls down to 10, 12 degrees here, this pond's going to freeze over. And even though the adults can freeze and tolerate the freezing, the egg masses can't. When those eggs freeze, all the eggs that end up being frozen are goners. They're dead. These erratic weather patterns are impacting the wood frog in this stage, but they may also impact the wood frog here at the southern limit of its range, because these are frogs that like to live in cool, moist woods. It's an upland frog, and it only comes down to these temporary ponds to breed. And as summers get warmer and drier here, these wood frogs are in danger of even persisting as adults. So we're here on the front lines of where the wood frog is facing the challenge of a changing climate.
The first warm, drenching rain in March is a great time to make your way down to the coastal plain to find some really neat frogs. I'm off to Craig's Pond in Barnwell County to search for what is possibly the rarest frog in the Carolinas. But today, there's at least 5 species of frog calling.
This isn't a pond. It's not a stream. It's really just a rain puddle. Here in the coastal plain, when you have divots and ruts like this, after torrential rainfall, they'll fill up with water. And that water may last a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe longer. But that's long enough for one amphibian to take advantage of it as a breeding site. And it's the one that you hear calling around me right now. We call it the mystery frog because you'll hear it calling just a few feet away from you, but during the daytime, you just can't find him.
These rarely seen tiny frogs with the large voices are chorus frogs. They're pretty easy to tell apart by their voices alone. The ones calling around me right now are Brimley's chorus frogs, named after the famed herpetologist C.S. Brimley of the North Carolina State Museum. Later in the evening, they're joined by the southern chorus frog and the unusual chirps of the exquisite ornate chorus frog. You may never have seen these tiny frogs, but I bet you've seen, or at least heard, the largest and most conspicuous one, the spring peeper. They're still small, but they're giants compared to the tiniest of the chorus frogs, the little grass frog. This is the smallest frog in North America.
As you can tell by all the noise around me right now, Carolina bays, like Craig's Pond where we're at today, are perfect amphibian habitats. They're great for frogs. And when this pond fills up with water, it becomes perfect ephemeral pond breeding habitat for frogs. We call it an ephemeral pond, which means short-lived. And that's because this pond, Craig's Pond, dries out during dry years. Because it dries out, That means that fish can't persist here long term at least. But we're here to see one of the most elusive and rare frogs we have in the Carolinas. We've knocked around out here and heard about 5 of them calling, but I think we'll hear a lot more than that tonight. If you're wondering why it's hard to find these frogs during the day, take a look at this. This is a frog you don't run into very often, and I'm so excited to see these out here. It's the first time I've actually ever found one of these frogs in South Carolina. This is the Carolina gopher frog. This frog is the one that's all around us here, making this tremendous, low, snoring roar, patterned with spots. And look at the warts that are on the skin of this frog, and that gigantic mouth. It's a carnivore. And gopher frogs, they'll eat anything that fits in their mouth. And that includes other frogs and toads. This animal is out here only for a couple days after a rainstorm. The rest of the time, he's up in the flatwoods, he's up in those sandy, dry sand hills, living where he normally lives, underground. It gets its name gopher frog because it's a burrower. It's not a gopher, but it'll actually live most of its life in burrows underground. Now, those can be burrows of small mammals, root channels after a root decomposes in the ground, or even the burrows of things like gopher tortoises. It's a fantastic animal, but it's an animal that's already in decline. And when we talk about things like chytrid fungus and the threat that it poses to amphibians worldwide, the amphibians we're most worried about are those like the gopher frogs, those that are already rare. It's rare because of a number of different environmental problems. It's dependent on those sandy, dry, longleaf pine flatwoods and sandhills. So we have less than 10% left of the original landscape of longleaf pine out there, and very few acres of that actually have intact ground cover. You gotta remember, this guy's spending his time on the ground. He depends on having intact ground cover. Things like wiregrass and bunch grasses that are easily displaced. And then loss of wetlands. This frog has to breed in places like this, ephemeral wetlands, places that dry out, fishless ponds. Any change to the upland habitat and any change to what's going on at the ground or below the ground will greatly impact this species.
The gopher frog is a member of the true frog family. We have 9 species of true frog in the Carolinas. Most are what you'd consider to be typical frogs, and you don't get much more typical than the bronze frog. This is the southern version of the green frog. It has a recognizable gulp for a call. Some, like the pickerel frog, are much more colorful. Their square spots and bright colors warn potential predators of the toxic skin secretions. The southern leopard frog is a look-alike that's much more abundant here in the south. Take a good look. You've probably seen it before, at least in your high school biology class. They're extremely important for teaching anatomy. This begs the question, who would miss frogs if they were gone? Well, the U.S. consumes 1.25 million pounds of frog legs every year, but more than just humans depend on frogs. American bitterns feed heavily on them, and as frog populations have declined, so have the bitterns. Abundant tadpoles can even be important shorebird food. Many of our reptiles have a strict amphibian diet. Ribbon snakes search marshes for frogs, and the southern hognose appears to be entirely dependent on spadefoot toads. So frogs provide a critical link in the food chain, but they also consume vast quantities of insects. A population of 1,000 cricket frogs has been shown to consume almost 5 million invertebrates in 1 year. As the calendar moves towards early spring, different frogs begin to call.
This is another of the wonderful natural features of South Carolina. This is a freshwater marsh. And this isn't necessarily a place that's fishless, but it's a place that we find a whole nother set of amphibian species. It's also a place where we find some of the most remarkable plants that you have in South Carolina. This time of year, great time to come out and start looking for frogs. The dogwoods are blooming. Clematis crispa, one of the most beautiful flowers that we have in the pinelands and wet marshes of the Lowcountry, is in full flower right now with beautiful blue pendant flowers. And my favorite marsh plant is in full and glorious bloom. This is golden club. Now it gets the name Golden Club because of this bright golden spadix of flowers that it has. And this is a plant that's actually related to Jack in the Pulpit. It's an aroid. Unlike Jack in the Pulpit, it doesn't have that spade, that leaf that subtends this beautiful golden club of little minute flowers, but it's in the same family. If we take a leaf of this plant and drizzle water on the leaf, what you'll find is the leaf sheds water just like mercury, just like quicksilver off that leaf. We can take this leaf and completely submerge it in the water, lift it back out, and it's completely dry when it comes out of the water. Never wet. That's because of the thick wax that's on the top of this leaf. You have to be out here early to mid-April to see it in flower. It's the same time of year that you want to be out here if you want to catch some of the wonderful frogs that make their home here in our marshlands.
As night falls, strange calls resonate across the marshes and swamps. One of the most peculiar hardly sounds like a frog at all. Listen to that. It sounds like a carpenter banging a hammer on a nail. This is the carpenter frog. It's a true frog, about the size of a wood frog, with pretty stripes down the back. You find it restricted to the highly acidic waters of our coastal plain, but that's far from the only frog calling tonight.
On the first warm, rainy night of April, these guys start calling. This is a gray tree frog, and it's one of two gray tree frogs. It's a little hard to tell which you're looking at. That's because we actually have two species of gray tree frog. The Cope's gray tree frog and the other gray tree frog species, Hyla versicolor, the common gray tree frog, are nearly identical, if not identical, in the way they look. If you can't tell the difference between these two gray tree frogs, don't feel too bad. Even the gray tree frogs themselves have to use their voice to tell each other apart. The Cope's gray tree frog has a much slower and lower pitched voice. And the females use that voice, use that call to make sure that they're not mating with the wrong species. So they're not toads, they're not true frogs, they belong to their own family, the tree frog family, which have these wonderful pads that allow them to climb high into trees. And we call them tree toads oftentimes locally here in the South because their skin is actually very warty. It's covered with these little bumps. We do have true toads here too. This guy right here is a true toad. And this guy looks like he is a southern toad. That's the most common toad species in the coastal plain. But we can tell this isn't a tree frog because it lacks those enlarged toe pads. But he also has these large parotoid glands right behind the eyes. And these glands secrete toxin, and that deters predators. You even have to watch dogs because if they take toads and eat them, oftentimes they'll foam at the mouth. Well, they've been poisoned by the toad, by the parotoid gland secreting toxin. That's how this guy stays safe. He only comes to water to breed. The rest of the time, he's up in the uplands, feeding and living on land. Well, there's an amazing diversity of frogs here at this site in Charleston County, but it's surrounded by thick forest. To find some of the more interesting frogs, we actually have to venture out into ponds that are in longleaf pine uplands.
Let's clear up one myth right now. Toads and frogs will not give you warts, even if they do decide to urinate on you. There are 4 species of toad in the Carolinas. The oak toad is the smallest and most distinctive, with that white stripe running down the back. Like many of our amphibians, it's found in open, fire-maintained longleaf pine woodlands. That's also where the crown prince of tree frogs is found. So I'm on my way up to the fall-line sandhills of Richmond County, North Carolina, where I've seen large numbers of tree frogs breeding in the past. Late May and June are great times to seek them out. Again, at night, after large storms fill breeding ponds.
Quack, quack. It's a cute noise, isn't it? One of the most colorful and beautiful frogs in the world here. These are green tree frogs. And green tree frogs are very aptly named. He's just absolutely brilliant green, sort of the quintessential tree frog, and a very, very common tree frog, even still throughout the South. These guys have a very distinct lateral stripe, a white or cream-colored stripe that runs all the way down the side. We had at least 3 green tree frogs singing right here from this clump of brush. And you'll notice he hops around, but really green tree frogs pretty typical of tree frogs. They'd rather hop short distances and move around by crawling. Just fantastic little acrobats. They just stick to anything that they touch. He spends most of his day just sort of hanging out on vegetation, just sitting, camouflage. That's what that green coloration is really for, is for camouflage, and really quite a friendly frog. It's perfectly adapted to living up above the surface of the pond, and that's a great strategy because there are a lot of things in this water right now looking to eat frogs. I used to bring students here all the time when I worked at the North Carolina State Museum. And this time of year, after a rainstorm like we had last night, there would be thousands of frogs singing around here. And tonight, really, I guess we probably have 100 green tree frogs, and it's the end of May. That's prime breeding season. And used to be I'd come here, I'd see barking tree frogs, green tree frogs, pine woods tree frogs. Tonight, just greens. So not sure exactly what's going on here, but an extreme drought is bad news for something that has moist skin. So maybe bad news for a beautiful little green tree frog. Not all frogs have musical voices. That real high nasal twang that you often hear on warm summer nights is caused by a frog that produces a voice that is so much more powerful than the size of the frog would indicate. He's from a different family of frogs altogether than the true frogs, or the toads, or the tree frogs. This is a narrow-mouthed toad or narrow-mouthed frog, and it's not hard to see why you call them narrow-mouthed, because they have a very, very narrow head and a very pointed snout. Again, that's not a real toad, and it's actually not a real frog. It belongs to its own family, and it's the only member of that family that we have here in the eastern United States. He's also neat because he's important ecologically out here. This guy specializes almost entirely on eating ants. It's a great thing to eat if you're out here. There's lots of ants in the sandhills. They're also fascinating because they burrow. So a lot of times when you find this thing, they're not usually out this far into the open. Usually you find them, they're either tucked underneath grass or ready to burrow back down underneath loose soil or grass. So a burrowing frog that uses his back legs to make his little burrow, and really doesn't look like any other frog species that we have in the Carolinas. Not the most colorful, but definitely one of the most peculiar amphibians we have.
A new day gives us the chance to explore the sandhill seeps. They're loaded with rare and unusual plants and animals. And just as I had given up on finding the tree frog that specializes on the sandhills, there he is.
We were real frustrated last night because we were out here in these pecosins, these dense shrubby thickets, and we could hear this real soft wham, wham, wham. And that song was being made by what most people would say is the most beautiful of all the tree frogs in eastern North America, maybe in the world. We found him out here, perfectly camouflaged on this dense vegetation around these pecosins and streamheads out here in the sandhills. This is the Pine Barrens tree frog. He has this beautiful green coloration that you see on green tree frogs, but it's set off with this beautiful lavender stripe that runs from the eye all the way down along the side of the body, and then these beautiful yellow spots and blotches that are on both sides of the back leg, even down onto the toes on this guy. And I love these little green stockings that he seems to wear on his front legs here. They don't go all the way to the toe tips. His toe tips are still just sort of lavender, and the top of his leg is also just sort of lavender. It's a great example of a tree frog that's really in trouble. It's in decline. And it's in decline for the same reason that many of our plants and animals in the coastal plain are in decline. That's because of habitat loss. It relies on these really cool, moist seepage habitats that occur here in the high sandhills. For many years, these sandhills of North Carolina and South Carolina were considered wasteland. Today, it's one of the fastest growing regions. We have sandhills that are very quickly turning into golf courses. And that's unfortunate for these rare species that depend on these sandhill seep habitats. And one of the other things that may be endangering this beautiful animal may not be obvious at first. This animal likes to live in open sunny habitats, and as those decline because they grow up into hardwood forests, they get pushed into remnant areas such as power line clearings. But today, we manage those power line clearings by spraying herbicide. And a lot of recent research indicates that some herbicides may have the effect of completely eliminating some frog populations. So an excellent environmental sentry and a beautiful animal, one of the most beautiful frogs in North America, if not the world, and we're extremely lucky to have some of the largest populations left right here in the Carolina Sandhills.
With 8 species, the Carolinas are really the place to be for tree frogs. The distinct call of the rather plain pinewoods tree frog is often heard just before rainstorms in the summer. Yet another greenish-colored one is the squirrel tree frog. It's not as vibrant, and it's smaller than the green and the pine barrens, with a much harsher voice. The largest of all has a call that sounds almost like the bark of a hound. This is the aptly named barking tree frog. It can change color from the spotted form, often displayed at night, to this brilliant green pattern, again for camouflage. To find the tree frog with the most unusual voice, we have to travel to the southern corner of South Carolina, to the Webb Wildlife Center. This corner of South Carolina is home to several species that you don't find today in North Carolina, like the pig frog and the very unusual river frog. This is a juvenile river frog. Eventually, he'll reach the size of the bullfrog he's lounging with. River frogs have incredibly strange voices, but this is my all-time favorite.
How do you like that noise? What a song, huh? Sounds like he's trying to call a dog. This is the coolest of the tree frogs to me. This is Hyla avivoca, and avivoca means bird voice in Latin, and this is the bird voice tree frog. This is a frog you've probably never heard, you've probably never seen. It's a localized species, and in the eastern part of its range, it's really just found in a little corner of Georgia and this little southwestern tip of South Carolina. And they come in 2 color phases. One of them, like this, the prettiest, is the one that's green on the back. The other color phase is sort of brownish, looks a bit like a spring peeper or pinewoods tree frog. But if you look at the distinctive marking right here, you see there's a bright green patch below the eye. It's one of the distinctive characteristics. Look at those toes. Those front toes are just incredible on this tree frog. They're elongate, they're just super long and super strange, almost like having a little golem up in the tree there. Another really distinctive feature of this frog is that skin, that smooth skin, secretes a toxin. Just like we've seen in a lot of the frogs, but in this case, it's an irritating substance that actually affects humans. So if you handle this frog and then you touch your face or get your hands up near your eyes, a lot of times your eyes will start watering like crazy and you start sneezing. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not gonna get any closer than this to this frog, even though it is my favorite here. It's a very late singing frog. This one oftentimes doesn't start singing until the very heat of late spring and early summer, days like today when it was 100 degrees outside. But once it starts singing, wow, what a glorious chorus. It's a fitting place for us to end our look at the amazing frogs of the Carolinas. And that haunting voice is a great reminder that this song, this spirit of spring, is very fragile, and it requires our constant diligence. A changing world is presenting some pretty daunting challenges to amphibians. But I believe we can meet those challenges, keep these things around. We can support innovative organizations that target frog conservation. But there's things we can do right at home, right in our own backyard. We can avoid using chemicals like herbicides that damage frogs. And we can also create habitat, small fishless ponds, artificial ponds, right in your own backyard. Little changes like this will go a long ways towards preserving that spirit of spring. I'm Patrick McMillan, wishing you your own exciting expedition.
Expeditions is made possible in part by the Low Country Institute, providing responsible leadership in the conservation of South Carolina's Low Country by helping local policymakers, landowners, and residents make informed decisions.
To order this or other episodes of Expeditions with Patrick McMillan on DVD, please visit www.clemson.edu/expeditions.
It only takes a moment to discover the beauty around you. Hi, I'm Bill Stubbs, host of Moment of Luxury.
Quiet talk, an ancient tapestry. Just look, you'll find your treasure, and joy beyond all measure. When you find your moment of luxury.
Coming up next.
Hi, I'm Mark Wahlberg, and Antiques Roadshow is visiting the capital of Silicon Valley, San Jose, California.
This poster ties for the most valuable single piece I've ever appraised.
Oh, wow. Oh my God, that is a lot of money.
Don't miss these appraisals and many more next time on Antiques Roadshow.
Watch Antiques Roadshow Friday at 8.
On Masterpiece Mystery.
Move it.
You ought never to have kept that baby. Other girls gave them away.
I want to get married, and nobody can make that decision for me. Not you, not the army, not nobody.
I mean, who cares about the color of your skin?
This isn't America, it's Great Britain, and we don't practice segregation.
Can't hide forever, boy.
Nobody heard or saw anything.
Boyle's War on Masterpiece Mystery.
Friday at 9.
Anybody who says that a faithful person has no questions, it seems to me their faith must be very brittle, because deep faith can move with questions in the world, and it's good for it to do so.
On this episode of Between the Lines, Rabbi David Wolpe. With his book, Why Faith Matters, Rabbi Wolpe takes readers of all denominations on a journey to the origins and nature of faith and the role it plays in modern life.
Between the Lines is next.
I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Some things take a while to come back.
3, 2, champions!
But I've got some good buddies. I guess they're helping me figure it out. Being used to doing something with a cigarette makes it hard to do it without one. But if I can relearn to hang out with my friends without cigarettes, then I can relearn anything without cigarettes.
Relearn life without cigarettes. Free at becomeanx.org. A new way to think about quitting.
In this budget crisis, LAUSD's nationally recognized arts programs are threatened. You may go to this website to donate any amount to assure that our students continue to learn in and through the arts.
Today we have a very special surprise for a very special family, and this house behind me is part of that surprise here in Galveston, Texas. Hi, I'm Bill Stubbs, and this is Moment of Luxury.
Moment of Luxury is sponsored in part by GalleryFurniture.com.
For over 28 years, Gallery Furniture has delivered furniture, Tempur-Pedic premium sleep sets, and home electronics across the country and across the world.